Hello, and welcome back to the Write Your Path podcast. My name is Lolly Spindler. I'm a writer, editor, book doula, and writing coach. And today I wanted to talk about how I have always used writing as a healing tool. This wasn't always in my conscious brain that I was using it in this way. But in retrospect, I realized I had always used it in this way. So I'll just back up. Ever since I was little, I loved writing. Whenever I was asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would always say an author and an illustrator. And half of that came true. But I always found a home in writing. It was just a natural way for me to express myself ever since I was a little kid. And I even was published a couple times in the Anthology of Poetry by Young Americans. And then in fourth or fifth grade, I actually had a writing teacher, a writing coach that my parents hired because they saw my interest in writing and they were like, she really loves this. Let's, invest a little bit more in this. And so they hired my fourth grade teacher. So I must have been in fifth grade at the time. So after school, I would sit down with him and do different writing exercises and explore writing in different ways. Shout out to Mr. Swanson. So I've always had this interest, and I had never really interrogated that interest and asked myself, where did this come from? And a couple years ago, I was listening to the audiobook of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, I think it's called. My friend had recommended it. Yes. And I never made it through the whole book, but I started listening to it. And it was really interesting. It was talking about childhood coping mechanisms. And it was in this moment that I'm in this Uber. I still remember I was in an Uber here in Mexico City. I can't remember where I was going, but I was listening to the audiobook and it just crashed down on me like a wave. I was like, oh my God, that's why I've always written and been drawn to writing, because ever since I was little, I've always had these really big emotions. And I never knew when I was little how to deal with those emotions. They would just kind of overwhelm me and I didn't know where to put them. And my parents didn't either. And so what they would do is they would lock me in the bathroom. This is kind of like an open joke in my family, which isn't that funny. But at this point, I've talked to my mom about it. She's like, I'm so sorry I did that. We read all the parenting books and that's what they said. You were so different from your sister. We didn't know what to do. So we just followed the advice that we got from the book. And I was like, look, you are my parent. You are a human. You are imperfect. I understand you were doing the best with the tools that you had. So this has been forgiven. But we have talked about it openly. And I realized that because I had these crazy big emotions, I didn't know what to do with them. My family didn't know what to do with them. And then I would be locked in a room with them, literally, that I never felt that there was a safe space for me to express those emotions. So what did I do? I went inward and I would start writing because I felt like I had no one really to talk to. There was no one there who was capable of handling these big emotions that I had and teaching me how to deal with them, because nobody within my immediate family had ever had this experience themselves. So there was no one really there to teach me, what do you do? What are the resources and the tools that we can implement when we're having big reactions and big emotions? That just wasn't something they knew how to deal with. So what I started doing as a child was I would just use my notebook as my outlet. I felt like there was no safe place to discuss these emotions. Nobody knew how to deal with them, so let me write them down. And what I was doing without realizing it was I was externalizing internal turmoil. So instead of that turmoil now ricocheting within my brain, having nowhere to go, I was externalizing it onto the page so that it was physically outside of me and it was tangible and I could see it. And it was kind of transforming this this turmoil into something I could now manage because I could see it. And it was now not only living inside of my head, it was living on the page. And as I've said before in this podcast, the act of writing really slows down what we're feeling, whatever emotion we're going through, so that we can physically write it out on the page, right? Like our hand cannot physically move as fast as our brain is moving. So in that act as well, I was able to gain some new perspective on what had been ricocheting inside of my brain. And it gave me a bird's eye view. It gave me a different perspective. It helped me really understand what I was feeling because I had to put it into words. So the act of writing it down, the act of having to use language and have these big emotions fit into words, and the act of being able to externalize it, all of these things I was doing intuitively as a child. And I didn't realize the power of that until later on when I looked back and I was like, oh my God, that's how I was processing emotion. That is how I was dealing with this trauma, was literally like writing it as a trauma response to be able to process my emotions. And it was just funny because in this Uber ride, I literally was like, oh my God, I literally turned a childhood response to trauma into my professional career. And I was just like, wow, how crazy is that? Like now looking back, I used this intuitive tool I had discovered to then create a living, right? And to this day, I make a living by writing and helping other people write and express themselves. And so I was just like, wow, like, isn't it crazy when we take a moment to stop and reflect what we actually discover about ourselves, about our paths, our professions, our family, right? The influence we have in our communities and on our circles. So this is how I started to use writing as an intuitive healing tool as a child. And throughout my life, I've always used journals and journaling as a way to kind of encapsulate what I'm going through. So I really view a journal as a prayer, and each journal holds a different prayer. I am very intentional about what prayer that journal will hold. So for example, when I left on remote year, I picked this very specific journal that I wanted to take with me throughout those 12 months so I could, really document my experience of traveling to 12 different cities around the world. And that's really the prayer that it held. And looking back now at that journal, it holds so much wisdom, but also so much grief. I had gone through a really bad breakup prior to leaving on remote year, which included like stalking. It had included emotional manipulation, and seeing myself process through the page is really impactful looking back on it. And I literally look back and sometimes I cry because I'm like, wow, like I was hurting so much. And this was the only tool I had then. The only tool I had back then was to write it down in a notebook. And thank God I at least had a tool, right? Thank God there was at least one tool in my toolbox, and also my community, right? That's always been a tool. But I didn't have the tools I have now in my toolbox. I didn't have meditation. I didn't have breath work. I didn't have movement in the way that I use it now. I didn't have a lot of the tools. And I look back and I read these entries and I'm just like, wow, like she was doing the best she could with what she had. And thank God I at least had the power of the written word to process the emotions I was going through at that time. Because not only, right, was I going to all these new places and meeting all these new people and having all these new experiences, but I also was grieving this deep loss of identity, of partnership, It was like a very emotionally abusive relationship that I didn't realize I was in until, getting some distance, and that's all reflected in those pages. And so even if you come to my house now, you'll see I just have journals everywhere. And because each journal for me is a prayer, it holds a very specific intention. One that's sitting to my right at this moment is like my business notebook. So it's this beautiful notebook that my sister gave me as a gift. And I was like, only like the highest intention, the highest manifestations, the highest calling are going in here. And so it's like when I was starting my second business of coaching, of helping people build a life that they felt aligned with, whether that's through freelance writing, helping people tell their stories, through writing their books, helping people open the creative channel and start to write through the Write to Heal. All of that is contained in this one notebook I have. As I was downloading, as I was learning, taking all these courses from all of these other amazing entrepreneurial women that I admired, right? So that was the intention for that notebook. And then I have a ton of others, one for my trip to India and what I learned there, just going through day by day. What did we do? What were the takeaways, the little conversations that stuck out to me? So what I recommend, if you are interested in learning how to journal or how to process emotion and use writing as a healing tool, is to start with one notebook. Find a journal that really calls to you. It can be the design, it can be the texture, it can be a sentiment, someone who gave it to you, right? Be very intentional about choosing a notebook. And then I want you to put a prayer on that notebook. Place your intention for that notebook, whether that's starting the year, right? We're starting 2026. Maybe it's starting the year. For this year, this is my notebook for 2026. This is the intention I want. Some people like to do a word for the year. Some people like to have resolutions. I'm not a fan of resolutions, but if that floats your boat, by all means, you can start out by writing with your resolutions, with your word for the year, with your intention for the notebook. And I also recommend doing a little ritual around it. So whether that's lighting incense, lighting some sage, lighting a candle, and just really closing your eyes, taking some deep breaths, and placing that intention or that prayer on that notebook. And then I don't want you to force yourself. Like, nothing gets done if we're forcing our ways through it, right? It's all about ease and flow. So don't feel like you have to do this every single day for the entire year. Like, that isn't going to be sustainable for most people. So what I recommend is when you feel called, when you're going through something challenging, when you just had a difficult conversation, or you're going to have a difficult conversation, to use the notebook as a place to share and process what you're working through. So this is my invitation for you as we start this new year, is just to play with this and explore. And if you do feel like the blank page is a challenge, this is my personal philosophy. A lot of people will say that, creativity thrives when there are no boundaries and no limits, right? I disagree with that. My philosophy is that creativity thrives when there are restrictions or limitations placed upon us. So if you do feel one day like this impulse to write, you really want to write, but you're not sure how to get started that day, put a limitation on what you can write. Today, I am going to write about things in the natural world. For example, plants, animals. That's all I'm writing about today. How does that tie to my intention for this notebook? Or how does that tie to this difficult situation I'm dealing with? And it might sound kind of like bonkers and weird, but honestly, your brain will find a way to make the connection. And that is when the creativity will start to thrive, is because we're placing limitations on ourselves so that we have to go in directions we don't normally go in. Another thing you can play with is today I'm only writing as if I'm writing a song, right? So like this is going to be like a musical of my life. And this is the song I'm writing for the day. That can be really fun, especially if you're a musical theater nerd like I am. Or you can do a dialogue, right? Like you're writing a screenplay, and this is the dialogue between the two main characters or whatever, right? So have fun with it. Place limitations on it or fun restrictions. If you are getting a bit, you're like gawking at that blank page, because I understand it can be intimidating. But really use it as a way to process emotion, but also to explore and have fun. It doesn't have to be so serious the whole time. And a lot of time, if we do bring some creative energy to a difficult situation that we're dealing with or a difficult emotion we're processing, we start to bring a lightness to it. It becomes less heavy, less bogged down, because we're seeing it and, oh, you know what? This isn't as serious as I thought it was. Or I'm way overthinking this and creating way more anxiety around it than really exists in the present day. So play with it, have fun with it, and see how you start to see maybe these difficult encounters or emotions or moments in a lighter way, and give it a little bit of a lighter energy so that it's not weighing you down. And I really hope that you are able to see a different side of your mind by using a journal in this way. Because a lot of the times, if we aren't physically writing down our thoughts and emotions or sharing them in some way, and we're just letting them rattle around in our brain, we only know them in that one dimension. We only know how they seem or hear or sound, right, in our heads. But once we're able to externalize them and see them, through painting, through poetry, through song, through anything external, we really start to see our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions in a different light. And that can bring a lot of clarity into who we are, how we've been programmed, and maybe some changes we can make so that we can step into the version of ourselves that we really long for. So this is my invitation to you as we start off the new year. My other invitation is I am kicking off a new group of The Right to Heal at the end of January. So this is a 5-week group coaching program, and we use journaling in this way as this self-reflective tool, as this healing tool. And we journal every day for 5 weeks in community. And what I always recommend is you find a time during the day where you can really dedicate yourself. It should take 10 to 15 minutes tops a day to respond to your journal prompt. And these are really fun. Kind of like I mentioned, I like to put some restrictions on them to make your creative juices start flowing. So we write poetry, prose, narrative, songs, and we also play with different types of prompts in the sense that if you had to be a body of water, what would you be? Why? What does it look like? What does it feel like, right? We really go into like the sensory experience. And we also just, it's a place for exploration, for creativity, also for community. I always ask people to share if they feel called. You're not required to share, but a lot of people find a ton of benefit in the voice activation part of the program and in sharing. And in so sharing, they realize they're not alone. They realize they're not the only person who has ever had this like crazy thought or feeling. And so there's this beautiful communal aspect of the groups too. So we journal together for 5 weeks, and each week we explore a different mindfulness activity. In other words, we explore some of the tools that I have added to my toolbox since those days on remote year when all I had was writing in my notebook. So our first week we explore gratitude, we implement a gratitude practice, then we move on to breath work. And each week I share a playlist. So even though in our calls are 1 hour a week, I will share a breathwork practice, for example. I then share a playlist with tons of different breathwork practices. So you on your own time, if you feel called, can go in and explore different types of breathwork to see if one really resonates with you. And then we move on to movement. We do some gentle yin yoga. We do some voice activation. I sing mantras. You don't have to sing, but I recommend my students engage the voice in some way, whether that is recording themselves in a voice note on their phone, whether that's sharing something they've written with a partner or a best friend, or if it's even starting a Substack and posting some of their entries or some of their poems or whatever they've written on their Substack. So these are some of the ways that I engage mindfulness throughout the Right to Heal. Like I said, we focus on a different activity every week. And for the content of the program, since it is, really about self-reflection and exploration and healing, we start in the past and we start taking stock of, where am I not aligned? Like what from my programming or for my background, how I was raised, is no longer aligning with the person I want to be. Then we move into the present. What small incremental changes, steps can I take today that can get me on that more aligned path? And then we move into the future of, I know what I want. This is how I want to write my path forward. And it's really paving the way to that beautiful life we all dream of for ourselves. And that feels most aligned, most impactful, most at ease, most abundant. So that is happening at the end of the month, at the end of January. So if you feel called to join us, I would love for you to be a part of this group, this special New Year's edition that I will be running. So if you're interested, I will leave all the information in the show notes, but also always please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can find me on Instagram at LollySpin, and I will be happy to answer any questions you have. But yeah, even if you don't join us, I hope that you still can find that beautiful notebook, place your prayer or intention on it, and really start to not only have to deal with your struggles in your head, be able to externalize them and see them for a different way, from a different perspective, and see what magic that starts creating for yourself and how it starts helping you resolve some things that have maybe been bouncing around in your head for a long time. So that is my hope for you for this year. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you guys on the next one. Ciao.